This case is not about Mr. Winkle's reliability, as the defense will try to make it. This case is about the defendant who tried, and tried again to put Matthew Reese, an innocent man, behind bars. Now today, people had two elements to prove. One, that the defendant deceived or exerted undue pressure on Emery Winkle. And two, the defendant did so with the intent to influence Mr. Winkle's memory. Before we go into detail on the elements, though, I want to talk about the defendant's motive in this case. Now, you already heard that the defendant tried and failed to convict Mr. Reese 3 times. We even heard Officer Bryan confirm that the defendant always looked to Mr. Reese when there was an investigation where no suspect was to be found. But every single time the defendant arrested Mr. Reese, the case was dismissed. And by the 3rd time, this wasn't just a detective going through his daily work. This was personal. The 3rd time, the defendant arrested Mr. Reese for assaulting the defendant himself, and the case was dismissed. The defendant was tired of his hard work being dismissed. The defendant was tired of Reese getting away. The defendant wanted Matthew Reese behind bars. To see that, all we have to do is look at the timeline of events. May 1st, the murder. May 2nd, the defendant is at Mr. Winkle's door questioning him. Keep in mind, the defendant is the only one questioning Mr. Winkle. But on May 2nd, Mr. Winkle says he didn't see Mr. Reese. Now keep that in mind, because on this report the defendant wrote himself. It says that the defendant arrested Matthew Reese on May 3rd, even though the only evidence he had was a witness who said he didn't know who he saw. But later that night, the defendant realized what he'd done. He realized that if he didn't change the state of the evidence, Matthew Reese was going to get away for the 4th time. That's when the defendant decides to steal Karen Turner's necklace and show up at Mr. Winkle's home in the middle of the night. That's when he tells Mr. Winkle that Karen Turner's necklace was found in Matthew Reese's tent. And here we have the evidence to prove it. This necklace. Now, at the beginning of this trial, the defense said that not a single witness would be able to corroborate Mr. Winkle's version of events. But think back to Dr. Scher's testimony. You heard him admit stipulations 7 and 8 corroborate Mr. Winkle's testimony that the defendant came to his house on May 3rd and gave him this necklace with Karen Turner's fingerprints on it. But then you see that in this homicide report written by the defendant, there isn't a May 3rd conversation. In fact, there's no record of the defendant ever giving Mr. Winkle that necklace. First element of witness tampering is simply that the defendant deceived or exerted undue pressure on Emery Winkle. You heard Mr. Winkle's testimony. The defendant came to his home 3 times, each time pressuring him more and more to testify to a certain way, to certain words, 100%. As if that weren't enough, the defendant lied to Mr. Winkle over and over, saying Mr. Winkle had already been convicted of 3 crimes, saying that Karen Turner's necklace was found in Mr. Reese's tent. The defendant didn't just try again. The defendant lied, and lied again. There's no reasonable doubt as to whether the defendant deceived or exerted undue pressure on Emery Winkle. Now, the second element of witness tampering is that the defendant intended to influence Mr. Winkle. The people can prove intent in 2 ways. One, that the defendant purposefully influenced Mr. Winkle, or 2, that the defendant knew his actions were likely to influence Mr. Winkle's testimony. Now today, you heard Dr. Scher admit that having a witness only look at one photo of one suspect is bad police heard Dr. Scher tell you how vulnerable witnesses can be easily influenced by police officers. The defendant was a detective for several years before 2003, as you heard from Officer Bryant. He knew the process of having witnesses identify suspects, but he still showed up at Mr. Winkle's home 3 times, still lied to Mr. Winkle about the evidence over and over and over again, and still only showed him one photo of one suspect. Even if the defense argues that the defendant somehow didn't purposefully influence Mr. Winkle, there is no way the defendant didn't realize that his actions were likely to influence Mr. Winkle. There is no reasonable doubt that the defendant intended to influence Mr. Winkle. The defendant tried again to put Matthew Reese behind bars. He tried whatever he had to, as many times as he had to, and finally succeeded in putting an innocent man in prison for 12 years. That is why people request you find the defendant guilty.
Thank you, counsel. Defense? Mr. Park, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. And before I proceed, permission to turn around the exhibits.
Sure. Ms. Darlington, how much time remains for rebuttal?
2 minutes and 55 seconds.
Thank you.
In 2003, a woman named Karen Turner was murdered. Anne-Marie Winkle testified that Matthew Reese was the killer, and Matthew Reese, an innocent man, spent over a decade in prison. The system did not work. And now, the government's looking for someone to blame. They're trying to find someone to blame. Mr. Winkle is trying to find someone to blame. And they've decided to blame Detective Parker Jones. As I told you in my opening statement, the government came to court today bearing the highest burden in our justice system. Today, for you to rule in their favor, they had to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to walk out with an abiding conviction that Detective Jones engaged in witness tampering. But how came? Because the evidence they presented just isn't enough. I want you to think back to today's trial. And think back to each and every piece of evidence the government presented against Detective Jones. And ask yourself, who originally told you that evidence existed? Who originally told you my client acted the way he did? Who did the government rely upon first and foremost to point the finger at Detective Parker Jones? The answer to each and every one of those questions was Anne-Marie Winkle. The prosecution today called one of them a federal felony case. They called one of them. One. Not just any witness. They called a witness who's been mistaken before. A witness whose mistaken testimony has put a man in jail before. And Mr. Winkle's 2000 mistake is one thing. There's more. Mr. Winkle had a reason to mislead you today. See, today you heard that when Matthew Reese's conviction was overturned, Mr. Winkle received death. He received hate. He was confronted by the FBI. He was in a meeting with a federal prosecutor. And it was only after he told you months of those meetings that he decided to testify against Detective Parker Jones. It was only after a deal granting him immunity from prosecution that he decided to testify against Detective Jones. It was only then that he decided he'd been pressured. It was only then that he decided he'd been coerced. It was only then that he decided there was someone else to blame. He's the government's only witness. Now, at the beginning of today's trial, I asked you to evaluate Mr. Winkle's reliability. And today, you heard from an expert in eyewitness reliability, Dr. Tatum Sher. Dr. Sher took the stand and told you that memory is imperfect. He told you that Mr. Winkle's mistaken ID in 2003 could have been just that, a mistake. Well, given the circumstances and unconscious transference, it's reasonable that Mr. Winkle convinced himself that he'd seen Matthew Reese that night free of any coercion. And members of the jury, that's what this case really comes down to. Is there a logical explanation for Mr. Winkle's wrong ID other than coercion? An expert told you the answer is yes. Dr. Sher also told you that it's plausible, it's reasonable that Mr. Winkle is fabricating his interactions with Detective Jones. The government presented you with a necklace. They told you about a single photo. But I want to be very clear. Giving someone a necklace, showing them a single photo, even if these things did happen, that may not be the best procedure. That may not be the best police work. But under the law, that is not witness tampering. That is not what Detective Jones has been charged with. So let's talk about exactly what Mr. Winkle said when he was referring to the actual instance he claims to have been pressured. Because direct, Mr. Winkle actually told a compelling story. How he was lied to, how he was deceived. He even gave this court direct quotes. He said Detective Jones told him in 2003. But then, on cross-examination, I asked Mr. Winkle about his memory. I asked him, do you remember how many times Karen Turner was stabbed? The number he gave was different from the number in his 2003 court testimony. I asked Mr. Winkle, on direct, you said Detective Jones told you that his rookie's cop's fingerprints were found on the necklace. Can you show us where in the affidavit that is? You said, oh, I must have been mistaken. Well, members of the jury, that's actually quite normal. It's quite reasonable. We forget things. We mix things up, especially 13 years after they happen. But why? Ask yourselves why. If Mr. Winkle mixed up those basic facts, if Mr. Winkle couldn't remember those basic facts, why can he claim to remember direct quotes from Detective Jones 13 years after they happened? Dr. Sher told us that in his affidavit are direct quotes. Mr. Winkle on the stand gave us direct quotes, word for word for word for word, 13 years after they happened. Why can he remember them? The answer is that he can remember those quotes because he made them up less than a year ago, and he decided to claim coercion. An expert told you that's reasonable, and because that is reasonable, there's reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, another officer got up on the stand today. Another officer told you that Detective Jones was honest, that Detective Jones was by the book. There will be a stipulation when you go into deliberations that Detective Jones was never been faced with any disciplinary action before. In 2003, an innocent man went to jail on the basis of Emery Winkle's mistaken ID. And now the government is trying and trying again and again to place the blame for that mistake onto Detective Parker Jones. But one witness looking for someone to blame is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. One witness with a reason to lie is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Don't let the government convict Detective Parker Jones for Emery Winkle's mistake. In a few minutes, in a few seconds, really, opposing counsel will get up here and try again and again to tell you that the evidence is enough. But members of the jury, you know exactly what happened in trial today. You know that all the evidence came from Emery Winkle. You know that the evidence is not enough. The government has failed to meet their burden. We request a verdict of not guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Ms. Snell, do you wish to give a rebuttal argument?
Of course, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Parker just ended on something interesting. He said that Emery Winkle originally told you about every piece of evidence. But that's simply not true. Let's consider the evidence that Emery Winkle didn't say anything about. Exhibit 6. Emery Winkle never testified to this, never even talked about it. Who did? The defense's witness, Dr. Tatum Sher. Dr. Sher admitted that the stipulations 7 and 8 corroborate Mr. Winkle's testimony that the defendant gave him Karen Turner's necklace on May 3rd. Dr. Sher admitted this police report written by the defendant has no record of that conversation or that necklace. That alone is enough to show that the defendant intended to influence Mr. Winkle, that the defendant was trying to cover up for his crime. But that's not the only evidence we have today. Let's look to Exhibit 9, this text that says we need to stick to our story. It doesn't say, oh, I found out Matthew Reese is innocent, I'm so sorry. It doesn't say, oh, I'm sure you made an honest mistake, it's okay. It says we need to stick to our story. Story. And another thing the defense has argued is that giving someone a necklace, showing someone a single photo, is not witness tampering. And that's true. You have to prove that the defendant intended to influence the witness's testimony. But the people have proven that beyond a reasonable doubt. All we have to prove is that the defendant knew his actions were likely to influence Mr. Winkle's testimony. And based on the evidence you've seen today, based on Dr. Sher's testimony, based on Mr. Winkle's testimony, there's no way you can find that the defendant didn't realize his actions were likely to influence Mr. Winkle's testimony. And finally, the defense has asked, why can Mr. Winkle remember the defendant's quotes? You saw Mr. Winkle on the stand today. You saw that he's kind of a scared man. And you saw the defendant came to his home in the middle of the night on May 3rd, pressured him 3 times to testify a certain way. Of course Mr. Winkle would remember those events, down to the very quotes. The defendant tried again to put an innocent man in prison. And he finally succeeded. That's why the people ask that you find the defendant guilty.
Thank you, counsel. Give them a round of applause.